And so with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you're in New York City, it is extremely hot today. It's also election day, so thanks for making the time to join us. Hopefully, you have already voted, or if not, are planning to vote later today. And for those who are joining outside of the city, thanks for joining as well. So we're excited to welcome you to another Waterfront webinar, part of an ongoing series that we have over the course of the year. And I'm particularly excited about this one because it has been a long time coming. Today's webinar is called Beyond the Public Comment Period, a Guide to Influence the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Projects. And as you can imagine, we will be discussing just that, how to better engage with the Army Corps of Engineers beyond some of the most obvious moments like a public comment period. Earlier this year, the Waterfront Alliance released a guide, which we called a common sense guide to working with the Army Corps. And we developed this guide to highlight how to work with the Corps to reduce the risk to communities and regions across the country for the impacts of climate change. And it's really a guide that's meant for a variety of audiences, including elected leaders, advocacy organizations, and community-based organizations, philanthropy, technical experts, academics, and residents who are just concerned and curious about what's going on in their city, in their state, and across the country with respect to climate. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here today. The PowerPoint and the panel will follow our kind of common sense guide, and we're really excited to have some really great leaders in the field here for our discussion to join that conversation, including partners from the National Parks Conservation Association, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez's office. So for those who don't know me, my name is Tyler Taba. I'm the Director of Resilience at the Waterfront Alliance, and I help lead our policy and advocacy work around climate resilience and adaptation. A lot of that is around the Army Corps of Engineers project here in New York and New Jersey called the New York-New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, or HATS, which you may have heard of. But I'm also really excited to be joined by some of my fellow colleagues who are also working on projects across different parts of the country or at a national level. So I'd like to let them introduce themselves. Maybe we can just go in the order quickly on the slide. Chad, Rachel, and Dan, if you want to come off mute, say hello, a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump right in.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Hi, I'm Chad Lord. I'm a Senior Director for Environmental Policy and Climate Change at the National Parks Conservation Association. My team tracks and helps advocate for NPCA and issues around energy and environment.
Thanks, Tyler. Rachel Rhode. I am a manager with Environmental Defense Fund as part of our Climate Resilient Coasts and Watersheds initiative. I'm based down here in Florida, so familiar with the heat that you guys are experiencing, but I lead our Army Corps advocacy work nationwide, but I'm intimately involved with a number of the studies down here in Florida, Louisiana, and Virginia.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Dan Wiley. I'm District Director for Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez in parts of New York City. It would be Western Queens and North Brooklyn. I've worked with the Congresswoman since 2000 when we had our ecosystem restoration feasibility cruise up the Gowanus Canal to get interagency cooperation on dealing with the environmental issues in Gowanus. And look how far we've come. Anyway, that was my first initiation with Army Corps of Engineers in 2000.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for introducing yourselves, and thanks for being on today. Okay, so we're obviously going to be talking about the Army Corps, and I do want to level set because people may have heard about the Army Corps in lots of different capacities. They do so many things across the country, or maybe you don't really know who the Army Corps is. So before we really dive in, I think we want to take a second here to talk about who the Corps really is and what kinds of projects that we're going to be actually focusing on in the conversation today. So for starters, the mission of the Corps is to deliver vital public and military engineering services, partnering in peace and war to strengthen the nation's security, energize the economy, and reduce risks from disasters. It's kind of a broad mission, but definitely an important one. And the Corps plays a really significant role in projects related to dam safety, water supply, hydroelectric power, and disaster risk reduction, which includes shoreline protection and flood control. And I think that's really what we're going to be focusing on today in today's discussion is the kind of coastal storm risk management, or CSRM, portfolio of the Army Corps of Engineers. They do lots of stuff like Dan was alluding to earlier, ecosystem restoration. But I think for the conversation today, we're really going to be focusing on this flood protection, coastal storm risk management level of the Army Corps, which is a really important part of what they do across the country. And so maybe just as a first question for everybody, we could go around and maybe everybody could speak about how you've worked with the Army Corps, what types of projects, local kind of versus national, and just to give a sense of like what your experience has been like in some capacity working with the Corps. So maybe we can start in reverse of how we did the introductions. We can go Dan, Chad, and Rachel, or Dan, Rachel, and Chad.
Well, yeah, after doing the ecosystem work, of course, when people need to do waterfront work, they need to work on the bulkhead, they want to put in a pier, they need approval by the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's regulatory. So that's really kind of the meat and potatoes of the Army Corps. But the flood risk management stuff after Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy, we had a lot of engagement on how to protect New York Harbor and the communities in New York and New Jersey with the with the HAT study. And it's been a struggle with groups dissatisfied with very hard kind of seawall approaches that cut off the waterfront. So that's the cliffhanger.
I'll chime in. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, at EDF, I think, so my first taste when I started working down here in Florida, I think, was getting thrown into the Miami Back Bay study, which is another mega study similar to what you experienced, Tyler, in New York with the Ninja Hat study. You know, it was getting thrown into that particular study, but also very lucky in the sense that was there already a local coalition of advocates who are the real experts on the ground. And I think EDF kind of found this place where we were already working at the national level on core policy, on things like the Water Resources Development Act. And because our team is very place-based with folks up and down the East Coast and along the Gulf, it made sense for us to also work more locally at the smaller scale with districts and with local sponsors. So, you know, getting involved in Miami and other places down here in Florida, like St. Augustine, we kind of ended up becoming this role of translating what was happening at the national level for folks on the ground at the local scale, to understand more of the choices that they could make and things they could ask for or request, and then vice versa. Because we were place-based, it allowed us to elevate those outcomes and concerns to the national level. So that's kind of been my experience, and that role has grown at EDF now. We're seeing that need everywhere, and why I'm now working across the nation, and you know, we're getting reached out to with other groups where the Corps is coming in their backyard. The Corps, as far as we know, is not going away, right? Like Dan said, they are the main decision makers at the federal level. They have, you know, billions of dollars in federal funding to do large scale efforts that local communities aren't able to do on their own. So, you know, there's a need to have to continue to work with them to get resilience at the local level.
Chad?
Yeah, I come at my experience with the U.S. Army Corps in a couple of different ways. So, for example, National Parks Conservation Association works across the country. We're focused on helping preserve and protect parks. So, you know, we have experience with partner agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, who works with an institution like the National Park Service to help protect those resources. So, for example, what's going on in South Florida, the work that we've been doing for decades to help replumb the system around the Everglades to make sure that it's getting the water resources that it needs in order to remain healthy for future generations. You know, we also have been working on a shoreline erosion problem around Indiana Dunes National Park in Indiana with lake level fluctuations in Lake Michigan. We're seeing and other infrastructure around the port. Near that park, we've seen tremendous erosion of beaches, and so looking at how to protect the beach resources and other ecosystem resources at Indiana Dunes is something we've been paying close attention to. And then obviously the work that my colleague Lauren Cosgrove is doing in New York to study and examine the impacts of the HAT study in Gateway National Recreation Area. So I come at those experiences with the U.S. Army Corps, but I also come at the experiences much like Dan does in terms of having worked for a representative of the Congress, understanding how the local communities come to work with their district offices of the Corps, plan out projects. I remember a project, for example, of trying to protect a local airport from flooding from the Mississippi River, and so planning for those kinds of impacts, what that process looks like, is something I also experienced when I was working on Capitol Hill for a member who had to help her communities navigate the bureaucracy. So those are the kind of the ways I've come at experiencing the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Awesome. I appreciate all that insight from everybody. And I guess I'll say a little bit about my experience as well, and just being based here in New York City, really focused mostly with the Harbor and Tributary Study, or HAT study, that's come up a couple of times, and working with our partners. Chad mentioned Lauren, and Rachel, your colleague, Kate Boycourt from EDF, also here in New York City, and so many others. Waterfront Alliance convenes a coalition called Rise to Resilience, and that's a coalition now of about 110 organizations across New York and New Jersey who come together to make climate resilience a more urgent planning and policy priority. And so we've really collectively come together to try to push the Army Corps of Engineers in our region into some of the concerns that Dan talked about, with just cutting off the waterfront and putting seawalls, to really think about what the future of our waterfront in cities and towns and in the harbor region as a whole looks like post Superstorm Hurricane Sandy, but also just into the future, as we've seen more and more rainfall hurricanes and storms come in, and the interior drainage issues, but also sea level rise and tidal flooding and all the things that are, looking into the future. And so thinking about how we actually use this moment with the Army Corps as such an important partner in the region to make a project that's really positioning us to think about what the future of our region looks like. And I think that's what so many people are doing across the nation, with especially particularly around the coastal storm risk management portfolio. And, I think this was alluded to, actually, Rachel, you kind of alluded to it, about just how important the Corps is and the billions of dollars that they have. And so I did just want to take a quick second here to also make mention, because I think, we sometimes hear about the Corps and it's in a negative way, or there's a lot of opposition to what the Corps is doing, but it's also really important to recognize how important the Army Corps is and the role that they play, and the role and how nobody else can really play that role, and how that's important now. So now more than ever, really, especially as we're seeing so many slashing of climate funds and federal agencies like FEMA and NOAA and the EPA, and how that really hamstrings our nation's ability to respond to climate disasters, but also hurts our ability to build resilience into the future. And so recovery from a storm is one thing, but building that resilience out into the future is another thing. And I think that's where the Army Corps has such an important role here, and maybe is not who we think of all the time as when it comes to flood protection across the nation. But few agencies, I think, have really shaped our country's waterfronts and shorelines in the way that the Army Corps has. And, maybe for better or for worse, we can talk about that here, but it's definitely important to know how they operate. And so, I just wanted to make a plug for that, just given how much funding the Corps has and the engineering expertise that they have, and how they're able to move projects forward in a way that a local government or a state or county government maybe is not able to. And one, I can talk about HATs again, like the Harbor and Tributary Study here has a $52 billion price tag on it, and none of that money has actually been authorized and appropriated yet. But it would be really hard to imagine, New York City or some towns and municipalities in New Jersey coming up with that kind of money. And so the ability for the Corps to really move large regional coastal protection projects is something that I think is really important, and a role that they play in the region. And so I just wanted to make that note, and I'm happy to pause here in case anybody else from the panel wants to jump in and say anything about what their perspectives are, and is the Corps more important, now more than ever, like the slide kind of says. Okay, so I'm going to take that as a yes, and we'll move right
I think
along.
we agree. I think we all agree.
Great.
I
Well,
mean, the only
so yeah, go
caveat I
ahead.
would say is that there are local state efforts and there are other sources of funding. Of course, there's FEMA has a lot of money for reconstruction. They have a tendency to, rebuild, put back what was there before. And then there's kind of a pilot to actually put in more resiliency. And then there's HUD, Housing and Urban Development actually had a competitive grant to do some resiliency we've seen on the Lower East Side. So it is possible for other agencies to do some of this work in a layered way. But it doesn't cover everything. It's kind of like this spot, that spot. So for the larger comprehensive thing, the Army Corps can really bring a lot of resources to bear.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit more too about that parcel by parcel and how you get into a comprehensive plan and the role of the public and advocates and Congress and the non-federal sponsors and everybody really all together and shaping that vision here as we start moving along. So before we dive into that, I do think one really important part of thinking about the Army Corps, and this is really a huge part of our common sense guide, is understanding the timelines and really holding steady through the project timelines. Because when you're talking about a real comprehensive plan like that, you're talking about a decade over decade potentially process from the planning to when the project is actually constructed. And so I think one thing that we wanted to do here is also set the stage for understanding the timeline and how to best engage with that timeline to advocate for better outcomes. And there's so many points and phases through it. And so let's maybe start diving into that. I want to give Rachel the opportunity to share here because EDF put together a really awesome story mapping tool about a month ago, which I think a link was just dropped in the chat for everybody to check it out. And so I'm happy to pass it off to Rachel here to maybe talk us through a little bit about the process and that timeline through the story mapping tool.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tyler. And to the guide that Waterfront Alliance has created, I think this is just taking that and putting it in a different format. So a lot of that similar information is packaged together. And I think it's exciting to have these kinds of tools coming out and hearing how useful they can be for folks. But like Tyler said, we about a month ago created this story map, and this was in response to a survey we did with all of our advocates, including Tyler and NPCA. We asked, what kind of things would be most useful as far as resources for you to be able to share with your local experts and communities, and actually trying to demystify the Corps process a little bit better. And so through that was where this story map developed. We felt like it was the easiest way to be able to share this type of information because it is a lot and it can be confusing if it's thrown at you all at once. And so really what this story map is meant to do is take you through the step-by-step portion of just the planning process. So this isn't necessarily getting to construction, but just probably one of the most influential phases of getting the outcomes that we know communities want to see in these efforts. And that starts at the very, very beginning, all the way from the conception of wanting the Corps to come to your backyard, all the way to a final report before it may get construction funding. And so this will take you through each step. It's hopefully a clear and accessible way to get at what can be like the black box of Corps acronyms and timelines and technical steps, because the Corps, just like all of us in the science field, love to use our acronyms. There's things like a glossary on here that break those down, FAQs. There's clear explanations of each step, what's happening from the Corps' perspective, and then also tips on how local advocates or even just residents can engage in the process. There's it'll lay out where in the process it may not be intuitive to know where you can actually engage, but where it is actually important to engage. And so even if your community is already in a Corps effort, you can kind of locate where you might be in the process, what to expect next, what kinds of feedback are really useful at that point, and then what to push for at certain points and where decisions are more finalized. And we have things on there like example templates of comment letters, examples of media campaigns that we've done, case studies from each of the regions that we've worked in. And it's really, it's meant to kind of demystify this process, so that, you know, residents and communities can engage at the right time with the right message. So we hope this is useful for folks, to, you know, especially as you're looking through the Waterfront Alliance's guide as well. There's a lot, I think, that we've tried to put together that just anyone from the general public can be able to understand. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Rachel. And I definitely appreciate the way that it's broken down here with the what happens in this step of the process and ways you can engage. It's very clear. And so I would absolutely encourage everybody to check it out and familiarize yourself with that step-by-step timeline. And so that link is in the chat, and would encourage everybody to check it out. And I think, you know, here's why we're really talking about and emphasizing this kind of holding steady through the timeline part of the slide, because the planning is just one part of this really long timeline that the Corps goes through. There's so many points which you can see, you know, laid out here in the graphic, overlaid with EDF's planning timeline here. And so some of the other processes include the pre-construction engineering and design, construction, operations, and maintenance. And so I can talk a little bit about that and how the Army Corps follows this kind of standardized process, but the specifics of the timeline can also vary depending on the complexity and the size of the project. And so I'll again maybe do a brief overview of this and then hand it off to Chad or Dan to maybe add anything here about the timeline as well. So coming out of the planning phase, which is again to Rachel's point, where some of the real key decisions are actually made, is when you step into the PED phase, or the pre-construction engineering and design. And that's where a lot of the detailed engineering and design of the study is put together. And that phase really prepares the project for construction, includes some of the detailed engineering, technical studies, and designs that are needed to begin the construction process. And so during this phase is when the Army Corps and the non-federal sponsors really finalize that engineering, design, and technical studies, to prepare the study to move into the next phase, which is construction, which is what you would expect it to be. It's a very long project timeline where the project is actually being built. But again, Congress and others have a really important role here in determining what that looks like. Is the project going to be built all at once in a lump sum payment, or is it broken up into phases and paid out over different cycles of WRDA or however the project is funded? And then lastly, but definitely not least, is the operations and maintenance, that last phase there, which is where it involves actually transferring the responsibility of the project, for the responsibility of the project's operations and maintenance to the local sponsor. And so that's actually who will maintain the project in perpetuity. And I think that's also really important to note, is that, you know, that ownership, it becomes then the responsibility of the local city, county, state to really own the project. And so, you know, we'll talk about this in a second when we get into the key players, but that's really why those local cities, towns, counties, and states have a really important role, because you're going to own this project. So it's really important that you get it right. But I wanted to pause here because the timeline can be very confusing, and turn it over to Dan. Maybe if you want to talk about some of the moments where Congress is really important in the process, particularly maybe in the planning phase around authorization and appropriation. And maybe you could talk about what that even means, what is appropriation and what is authorization, and where Congress kind of steps in.
Yeah, so basically, to do a project, you have to have authorization for the Army Corps to do the project. So Congress will pass in WRDA, which they do every 2 years, the Water Resources Development Act, makes a list of projects to authorize the Army Corps to embark on. And generally, it tends to be like you can do a study first, a feasibility study, basically. And each year you can appropriate money toward that feasibility study. Hopefully, at the end of the feasibility study, you come up with a record of decision or a agency milestone or something that takes you to the next step where we could go to construction. So then you have to authorize Congress has to authorize construction based on the feasibility study saying we can do this. We have the capability to do this. So if you're lucky enough to get to that stage, then you can start construction. Some things my experience has been with some other studies that it goes as fast as you can appropriate money to do the study. So sometimes it goes very slow, and then there's a cost share related to this stuff. So generally, the Army Corps will do a cost share agreement with the local agency. And sometimes if the local agency doesn't come up with their match on time, that can slow the process down too. So first you got to get the appropriation to get the federal money, then you need the matching money. They got to work together and cooperate to go to the next step. So that's kind of a general overview.
Yeah,
But
thanks.
Rachel or Chad, you could certainly
Yeah, I was gonna ask
chime in.
Chad maybe to step in here also and just talk a little bit about like, does every project follow this exact timeline? Is there flexibility in the timeline? And again, the Corps is not the only decision maker in the timeline, right?
Well, I think the biggest of the core projects follow this outline. The timeline always differs, to Dan's point, depending on the complexity. It also is dependent on the ability of Congress to act on its Water Resources Development Act, as Dan noted. The Congress typically only enacts that bill once every 2 years. So you get in the queue, you get in the bill, but the bill doesn't become law until it gets on the president's desk, and that only happens once every 2 years. And so first you got to get your study authorized. Congress says, go ahead and study this. Then you got to get your money from Congress. You have an appropriations process that you have to deal with, and they don't appropriate money on a regular basis if you follow those processes quickly. It usually falls into a continuing resolution, which is just so that gets more complicated. Once study is complete, as Dan noted, then you have to get it constructed, and then you have to get the money. So it's basically rinse and repeat. And so those timelines, not only are the timelines long for the scoping and the studying and the work that's going on the ground in the cities to map these projects out, but then you have to overlay the politics, which just adds a whole level of additional complexity to moving these projects forward in a kind of a quick way.
And just to give an example of where we're at this fiscal year, we go by fiscal years, and the federal fiscal year starts October 1. Generally, Congress is supposed to come up with a budget and pass an annual budget by September 30th. What happened this past year is, last year is Congress kicked the bucket in these continuing resolutions, which only funds the federal government at last year's rate, which is a cut because of inflation. And it doesn't add any new projects. And members of Congress in the House side can request 15, for instance, we can request community project funding. We couldn't get any of our 15, my member couldn't get any of our 15 community project funding requests because we ended up passing a continuing resolution that took us to the end of the fiscal year, meaning no new projects. So now we're going to go through this dance again in the fall to see if we can actually pass full appropriation bills for the various agencies to actually fund new projects. And we're going for 2 of them that we authorized in Florida 2024, for instance. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
If I could
Go
chime
ahead.
in
Yeah,
really quick,
please.
Tyler, to the point about how long these things take and the timeline actually following this process. I think we've learned in each of the studies we're all involved in, getting it right at, whether you know what authorization is, that is the Corps', Bible. They follow it to a T. They do not go outside of those lines. And so getting the authorization right if you can. And that's, including things like making sure they're looking at all the things you want them to look at and addressing the issues that need to be addressed, is likely that this process is going to be a lot smoother and follow this timeline, maybe, a little bit better than if it didn't get off necessarily to addressing the things that you wanted to address in your community, which we're seeing, with restarts and reinitiation. So I think those first couple of steps are really big in setting the tone for how the rest of the timeline plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. And I think we'll get to that too in a bit too, just as we think about the strategies for when and how to engage. That really early upfront engagement, I totally agree, is really critical. And so the real point, I think, of this whole big slide of the timelines and all that stuff is really just to emphasize again that it's a long process, and sticking the course and staying steady through that whole process is really important, and being committed to the best outcomes of the project over the course of the timeline, and not giving up, when things aren't going well, because it's such a long timeline that there's so many opportunities to really weigh in. And so I think that's really the message that we want to drive home here. And so I appreciate everybody for chiming in there. And I think as we segue into the next step beyond the timeline is, who are the key players that are involved over the course of this timeline and the entirety of the project? Because I think so often we think of it as being just the Army Corps. It's all about the Corps, and that is, we're as advocates often very frustrated with the Corps, and that's because they're the face of these projects. They're the ones that are, doing the presentations to the public, and so it's easy to see them as the sole decision maker, but it's actually not true. And in many ways, the Corps is actually just tied to a mission or an agenda or a mandate that comes to them from somebody else. And so who are those other people? And so I think for here, let's maybe it would be good to just dive through who some of those other people in the process are. And so, yes, obviously, it is the Corps is one of them. But who is the Corps? What does that mean? There's different levels of the Army Corps that exist. It's a military agency with a structured hierarchy. And so maybe Chad or somebody wants to talk a little bit about that hierarchy and the difference between the district level, the headquarters, and how the kind of different operations of the Army Corps at different levels, what that looks like.
Yeah, I think you've got it fairly well mapped out, although I would definitely encourage people to look up the maps of the core districts, because they're not contiguous to political lines. They tend to be contiguous to watershed lines, which make them kind of unique in terms of the way they organize their district level. But yes, the headquarters here in Washington, that's even split in two different places. In Washington, you have the Assistant Secretary for the Army for Civil Works, who's headquartered in the Pentagon, in Arlington, Virginia. But then you also have the Chief of Engineers, who does most of the day-to-day technical work, located at their headquarters here in downtown Washington on G Street, which is just actually a few blocks from my office. And so you even have this kind of split structure within Washington at the headquarters level in terms of who you need to talk to. Obviously, the ASA for Civil Works, Assistant Secretary, that's the political level. So those are the folks that are going to be making the political decisions in terms of where those resources are going to go. And they're going to be guided by all sorts of political decisions, including what's coming from the White House. The Chief of Engineers and his team are going to be much more focused on kind of the process-oriented stuff and the day-to-day kinds of activities. Some of that is mimicked in the district offices. I can't remember the total number of district offices, but there is a number of them around the country. And those are the offices that kind of consolidate the decision making at the regional level. And then you obviously have the district offices within the district, kind of these regions that bring it down to a much more local level. And those are the folks that the non-federal sponsors are probably going to have the most day-to-day interaction with. Would be those folks who are at those even more local district level offices. But that's kind of the verticalness of the institution as I've experienced it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think important to note, because it's the core and who exactly is in charge, and how do you interact with the different people who are involved there. So I appreciate that breakdown. And for us, I think we work a lot with the district offices, to your point, because they're local, they're here. We work a lot with the colonels and the project planning team that are based in the district offices, because you have a public engagement session, those are typically the folks that come out. But there's often also moments where we try to engage as advocates with headquarters, where they're the ones sending directives down to the district level office. And so I appreciate that that layout, Chad. And then, of course, another key player here, Dan, this one is maybe teed up well for you, is Congress, and that the Corps really effectively, I think, reports to Congress in many ways, and Congress holds a lot of decision-making authority over project planning and funding, as you mentioned earlier when we were talking about authorization and appropriation. Could you tell us maybe a little more about some of your experience and the relationship between Congress and the Army Corps?
Yeah, I mean, so, Congress, of course, authorizes projects of the Army Corps. The Army Corps has projects it needs to continue. So usually every year, the colonel of in our case, New York District, goes and visits the delegation of Congress members to discuss some of their priorities and the status of their projects. And we also discuss new projects we'd like them to embark on and kind of discuss the different vehicles for that. So it's kind of a dance. They're not supposed to come and ask us for money per se, but we can discuss the status of projects, and then we can kind of say what we want to see happen and make sure there's community engagement because at the end of the day, the projects need to serve communities.
Yeah, that's
And
right. And that
I think we did discuss kind of the word a 2-year cycle.
exactly.
And then that's the opportunity to add new projects or bring projects to the next stage, say from the completed feasibility study to construction.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think those last 2 points are also really important. The engagement, I put this first photo here on the top of the slide, is from an engagement session that Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez hosted around the Army Corps project. And I think it was one of the highest turnouts of any of the engagement sessions across all the projects. And so that's a really important role I think that Congress can play as a partner to the Corps, but also to the community to really make sure that the project is aligning and kind of that we've been talking about that a lot. So I appreciate that, Dan. And just,
I would
yeah,
also underline that, it was a village process. So we have the local, there you see Councilman Lincoln Ressler, we had Assemblywoman Emily Gallagher, the other councilwoman, one was from Brooklyn, the other was from Queens. We had both sides of Newtown Creek. So we had Julie Wan as a councilwoman on the other side. And most importantly, we had community groups and advocacy groups that are dealing with on the ground restoration efforts and access to the waterfront, like Newtown Creek Alliance, North Brooklyn Parks, North Brooklyn Neighbors, North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, Bushwick Inlet Park, Hunters Point Park Conservancy, and the list goes on, Western Queens Community Land Trust. So there's a lot of different groups that had a lot of feedback, and this was a forum actually for not just the one-way Army Corps giving their presentation, and this is what we're doing, but to hear feedback of how are we doing and what are we missing, and that's what the groups brought to bear when it came to using more natural features, dealing with different kinds of flood issues, not just storm surge.
yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Dan. And that goes to that. I think the bullets here about the final one here about supporting community engagement and holding the Corps accountable to hearing the feedback on the ground and then holding the Corps accountable. I mean, I know that Congress has written many letters to amplify some of the things that you just mentioned there about natural and nature-based features. And so that's a really important part of what the Corps can do as well is, we as the advocates and the public can send our regards and our comments, but then having Congress kind of side and back up what we're asking for is a really important tool. So I appreciate you laying that out too. And then just moving quickly along here with the rest of the key players, we talked a little bit already about the non-federal sponsors. I think I just want to put a pin on this one that I think this is actually one of the more overlooked key partners in the process. The non-federal sponsors are typically a city level or a county level or state level agency that partner with the Corps and act as that local companion to the Army Corps throughout the study. And they're really throughout the study from planning all the way to construction. And so importantly, they are a cost share partner with the Corps. Usually that follows like a 65 federal to 35 local cost share, but that can also be negotiated and look different, but they are a cost share partner. And so in the case of the harbor and tributary study in New York, when you're talking about a $52 billion price tag, that cost share is pretty extensive and expensive. And so, thinking about how you engage with the non-federal sponsors and they can leverage that cost share ability to really be support the advocacy organizations and the communities that weigh in on the projects. So for example, here in New York and in New Jersey, that's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC. And in New Jersey, that's the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, who are the non-federal sponsors. There's also a really important step called the agency decision milestone, and that's where those non-federal sponsors have to basically green light the process and say, yes, we are giving this the thumbs up to move forward and advance. And so that's a big moment where they can step in and use their power as the non-federal sponsor to move the project forward, to call for changes that are that the community or advocates have come out and said that they want to see embedded into the project. And Rachel, I know that was a big thing down in Florida where the non-federal sponsors really stepped up in a big way. So maybe just in a minute or so, if you want to talk a little bit about that process, I think that might also be helpful to contextualize what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, I think once we were able to, we had this local coalition of EDF and then local partners on the ground, and a big part of our work there is empowering the non-federal sponsor to understand what kind of choices they have and where they really have a voice in this. And we're very lucky, at least in Miami, the county being the local sponsor has the capacity and resources, right, to really be able to step into these situations. That's not always the case. Sometimes non-federal sponsors don't have whole resilience offices to be able to do this work. But in Miami, they decided to listen to the advocates and the public when they did not agree with the plan that was proposed. There were concerns from residents on environmental impacts and visual impacts of essentially proposed walls along our Bay Area, which is already, built up as close as you can get with apartments and homes. But there were also clear winners and losers with large walls going through neighborhoods, and the public just felt like they didn't know that this was even going on, or that they didn't have a say in the process, and the county heard them. And at that point, told the Corps, we are not moving forward, but we don't want to say no to this process. So, with that, the Corps did agree to reevaluate its approach and consider those concerns more closely. The public wanted more nature-based solutions. They wanted less of a visual and environmental impact. And so we actually were able to kind of restart the process in a way. And that was all due to the non-federal sponsor and listening to the public and advocates for what the community wanted, as opposed to being told what they needed. And so that just kind of is a good example of showing how a strong, engaged non-federal sponsor can really challenge what may often be kind of a default solution, and elevate the priorities of the community to kind of steer towards a more locally appropriate outcome.
Yeah, I appreciate you laying that out. And I think it's a perfect example of what we were talking about here with how this is such an underrated player in the process, and the level of power that they have. And so, I think it can be helpful, especially for the public and the advocates who maybe know some of these agencies better than they know the Army Corps. So using that relationship that you might have with people who work at the city or the state to start to influence the outcomes of the project can, I think, be a really important way. And so that's something that we really try to detail in the guide. And so I appreciate you breaking that down. And Chad, I see you came off mute. So maybe if there's something you wanted to add
Yeah,
here.
I think it's important to also note that, and from my experience, and Dan can weigh in on it, but they also have an outsized voice when talking about moving these projects forward through the congressional process as well. Obviously, they have a fiduciary responsibility to spend their resources wisely, and that, I know my former boss, and I'm sure other members of Congress are going to want to know what their local officials are thinking as they move forward, so they can so they are a very important ally or opponent, depending on the type of project, because they can either push forward a project that is very much responsive to the community, or they can push forward a project that's not, or they could stop a project that's not, or vice versa. So they do have sometimes an outsized role even in the politics, and in terms of trying to move these projects forward in Congress. So it's really important to your point, not ignore the non-federal sponsor because of the role they play.
Thanks, Chad. All right, just for the sake of time, I want to make sure we go through these last two stakeholders, really important, obviously. So we have us meaning, Waterfront Alliance, EDF, NPCA. Three of the four of us on the panel are advocacy organizations. And so, of course, this slide is going to say that we're dedicated to achieving the best possible outcomes. But I do really believe that that is true. I mean, one thing about the advocates is that we can hold all the stakeholders, all the ones that we just touched on, the non-federal sponsors, Congress, and the core, accountable. And that we also run long-term campaigns. We're committed to staying the course, holding steady through that project timeline. We've hosted comment letter workshops, how to write a comment letter, signing on opportunities for public comments. Some of us have traveled down to DC, met with members of Congress, and met with officials at the Pentagon. EDF has created really great public awareness campaigns, advertisements to try to push the core. And so just to really put a pin here, that there's a really important role in working with your local or regional advocacy partners and organizations. Dan mentioned at the public comment workshop that Congresswoman Velázquez held, yeah, there you go, the background with the with the public comment period, working with the local advocacy groups in your neighborhood even, and filtering up your feedback that way, I think is really important. And then you, of course, the public. The public has a really critical role, of course, in the process, where community members and residents bring their lived experience and their knowledge of what's happening in and around the community to these meetings and to the core and to to Congress and to the non-federal sponsors. The public voice, I think, really can be a counterbalance in these kinds of projects. And what that means, to me at least, is that you can make sure that the projects are aligning with the community needs and priorities that are in your neighborhood or in your city. And sometimes the core coming in from a regional or district level or wherever maybe is not as able to see that, or clearly able to see that. And so I think the public has a very, very important role in providing responses to the core and to the projects. And the core is actually required to respond to the public comments. And so it's not like you're just putting your comments into a void and nobody's hearing them. They are required to respond. And so, I don't know if anybody wants to chime in here, but we do have a few more slides to cover. And so I'm kind of running through these very quickly to get to this part, which is the when and how to engage in the core of or I guess core is not the right, the crux of, somebody else had that issue in our prep call, the crux of the issue, which is beyond the public comment period. And so we've talked about some of this already over the course, which is shaping the big early decisions. Rachel really talked about this in the story map in the planning phase, about early engagement to shape those, what we call in our guide, anchor decisions, which are things like the project goals and the scope and the boundaries and the site selection and the level of risk that you're willing to accept. How much protection are we talking about? Is it a big wall that's going to completely block the water everywhere, or do we build spaces in places where water can actually come in? Those are decisions that I think are made really, really early in the process. And to Rachel's point earlier, those are going to drive the technical and design assumptions that are moving forward in the rest of the process. And so setting that up really early is really important. And then the second part of this here on the slide is just about embedding equity really early. I mean, I think it's often we find ourselves responding to things. The core will come out, or the city or the state will come out and put a plan in front of you, and you respond to it. And so I think as early as you can, getting that information about who's being left out, who's being protected in front of the Army Corps or your local city and state officials is really, really important. Getting a sense of that from the get-go, it's a lot easier to embed that in the beginning and secure that in the beginning than to make changes once the process has really already started driving and then you're fighting back all the time. So I don't know if anybody has anything they want to say here about that early engagement and the role of that, but I think Rachel did a really good job of highlighting that, and so I just wanted to double down on it here. and again, not to drum on this too much, but there's an important part here that I think is about leveraging some of the community-led visioning and planning, which has been talked about a little bit as well, where you can build off of some of that visioning and planning. I can speak to the work that's been done here in New York and New Jersey after Sandy. There was so many community-led visions and plans. Some were government-led, but a lot were led by community-based organizations. And so really taking those visions and plans and taking that to the core as a starting place for the process, I think is really important. And a challenge that we've had is this getting to a yes versus no, which is saying no to what the Army Corps is really putting out in front of you versus having something tangible that you can actually go to them and say, well, okay, no, we don't want that, but here's a vision of what we do want. And I think that's what we've seen has been really effective in so many places, where not coming in and just saying, we don't want this. Okay, so what is the alternative? And then you don't have that vision. So the visioning and planning, I think, can be really, really important. And if it doesn't exist now, it's definitely not too late to start those processes now. And then the last thing here is just on implementation ahead of the core, and how you don't have to wait for that giant timeline and process to move into construction. There are moments to move smaller projects and parcels of work forward that can be integrated then into broader visions. And so, I know that's happening here in the city, and it's definitely happening across the country, and that those smaller projects can be embedded into the core's process. And there's other funding streams, to Dan's point earlier about FEMA and HUD and NOAA, to take advantage of that. You don't have to basically just sit around and wait for the Army Corps to come into action. And so
I
I
think
don't
it
know if
also,
yeah, go ahead.
since you have the East River Park
Yes.
raising on the right, I kind of also shows the Army Corps isn't the only agency that would have controversy on doing these projects.
Yeah, that's right. The park is now open for anybody that's in New York City and wants to check out the East Side Coastal Resilience Project. The phase 1 is now open so everybody should go check that out. And then the last slide here before we jump into some Q&A is just really this part about being prepared to act at all levels. And that's the point about the advocacy groups. I think, again, engaging with local, national advocacy groups, leveraging media, public relations. I think, Rachel, you had added this story here about the Army Corps' work down in Florida, I think. And so just, leveraging media campaigns, working with policymakers, it's really trying to tie this all together. So maybe for the last minute, I'll let everybody maybe say one or two things about just this beyond the public comment period piece, and what you kind of, maybe any last remarks before we jump into the Q&A, just about when and how to engage, and kind of tying everything that we've been talking about together.
I'm happy to jump in. I kind of, these are certainly by no means the only things to consider, especially in terms of long-term engagement with the Corps. But I think for me, some of the biggest takeaways are, that people might not think of, is building relationships both with the Corps staff, right? Developing, who in your district is kind of a point of contact that you can go to, and treating them like partners, right? I think the Corps, as we said, has often gotten a bad rep, but they are very interested in wanting to know what local communities think and feel about these projects. And the more you can create a relationship with them, the more they can learn from you and you can learn from them. I think in addition to that, staying close with the local sponsor, we've talked about that a number of times on this call. They really are the other half of the decision-making here. They, at the end of the day, have to be the ones that sign off with the Corps to move forward on anything. And so, creating relationships there, if you don't already have them, is going to be really important to advocate for your priorities. Internally, even, outside of the Corps process, it's important to have relationships with those sponsors, because they have their own efforts they're doing outside of the Corps' planning. And then I think it's worth repeating the showing up early and showing up often. I have found with these projects, persistence, as annoying as it can be, is probably one of the key things to also building relationships at both the districts and with local staff. And so where you can show up and where you can be persistent is key to these really long-term projects.
And I would also just make a plug for showing up late at the 11th hour before the agency milestone decision is made. We held this town hall two-way real conversation to Army Corps, which I think is a wake-up call in February before the close of the comment period, which is in March 2023, where their agency decision milestone target was in June. But the public comment had such overwhelming feedback on the scope, needing to prioritize nature-based features and looking at multi-flood hazards, not just one type of threat from the sea, but also from the sky, and looking at different kinds of drainage flooding issues, not creating bathtub effects, for instance, needing to work with nature. So organizations like CHAD's NPCA and coalition partners like New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, the Waterfront Alliance, a lot of local groups in the different neighborhoods, parks conservancies that are local, like I didn't mention Hunters Point Park Conservancy, which in the local community boards, they never came to the decision milestone, but went back to headquarters after we wrote them in September, asking them to comply with what we included in 2 rounds of WRDA in 2020 and 2022. It's called Section 8106, that basically requires the Army Corps to look at nature-based and multi-flood hazards. So basically the district went back to headquarters and asked for more funding to be able to address these community concerns and go back and do more engagement and more study. And so now we're at the point where they got more money, they didn't get as much money as they were originally asking, but they got like 4 million, and we're looking to get a briefing on the HAT study to hear what are the next steps and what are we going to be doing with this money going forward. So 11th hour, stay in the game because you can impact the outcomes.
There you go. Late and early engagement. And Chad, I'll pass it to you for a final word here, and then we can try to answer 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A.
Don't forget about the middle.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, with the
I see a Libra, the Libra.
No, that's great. Well, that's the end of the presentation, and so maybe I can stop sharing here and take a couple of questions from the Q&A with the minute or so that we have here. One of the first questions that came in is the Corps funding, is the Army Corps' funding getting cut similar to FEMA and NOAA, or is there any indication of that? Maybe meaning, is there any indication of that to come?
The president's budget did propose a cut to the U.S. Army Corps' budget, like it did for all agencies of the U.S. federal government, minus a couple of defense-related and immigration-related ones. So yes, it was a proposal by this administration to cut the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Question is, will Congress approve of those cuts? Typically, they have not, although I would anticipate perhaps a small reduction for the upcoming fiscal year. But those decisions have not been made. That process is just getting underway now, and we'll see what decisions Congress makes.
Thanks, Chad. I realize we're at 1 o'clock now. I mean, I'm happy to take another question or 2, but I just want to thank Rachel, Chad, Dan for joining, for being such great panelists and participating in this conversation, and everybody in the audience for participating in what can sometimes be a wonky and nebulous thing with the Army Corps. And that's all we're trying to do, I think, here is to break it down and simplify it and hopefully make it something that's accessible for everybody to engage in and participate in. And so just thanks everybody for joining. I know folks may have to jump off to another call, so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. My colleague just dropped a link in the chat for City of Water Day. If you're in New York and New Jersey and want to check out an event across the harbor, check out City of Water Day on July 12th. But I think with that, maybe we can wrap up. And just as a reminder, this webinar will be was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel for anybody to watch. But thanks so much again to our panelists for joining. Really appreciate your thoughts, and looking forward to continuing to work together.
Thanks, Tyler.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.